How does it feel to have lived long enough to see all of your favorite franchises go down in flames?
Feels great.
I don't know if you're aware, dear viewer, but many people didn't like the Star Wars sequels. This divide has resulted in an ongoing debate on whether or not the films were good, and as with all things in the current year, plus whatever, politics were inevitably drawn into the discussion. In March of 2021, a document appeared from a podcast called Rewriting Ripley that rocked much of the online Star Wars community. This document, depicted as a scientific and statistically based expose on the Fandom Menace, a group of people who have been vocal about their critiques of the Star Wars sequels, sought to illustrate how this segment of the fandom was related to far-right political viewpoints. To any casual viewer, these charts and graphs probably look very convincing, but are the data themselves really so convincing? Implicated in this analysis were many people who have discussed Star Wars online and were labeled alt-right by this document, including Mauler, Clownfish TV, That Star Wars Girl, and many others. But while this massive document, with its many graphs and word clouds, would likely seem scientific to the average viewer, oh, not to me, because guess what? It's not. Today we're going to look at the questionable analysis of the Fandom Menace and how criticisms of Star Wars films supposedly have created a rabbit hole into extremist politics by looking at this document designed to do just that. But does it really provide evidence for the claims of political extremism that the authors present, or is it all just corporate-aligned nonsense and propaganda made in reaction to the fact that audiences didn't like this very expensive movie franchise? Let's find out by digging into the data to better understand not just this document, but the impetus behind it, and further, the problem of scientism. But first, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, one that can allow you to enjoy a wide variety of media, particularly science fiction media, before Puritans like those at Rewriting Ripley have it removed from the Akashic record, and that's Surfshark VPN. Most media hosting sites like Amazon Prime and Netflix have some titles that are region-locked, meaning that what's available in the United States isn't always available in the UK or elsewhere, and vice versa. But with a VPN, you can quickly change your location and access a galaxy of media otherwise far, far away. For example, Stargate SG-1, one of my favorite science fiction television shows, isn't available in the UK. But Americans, similarly, are missing out on classic British sci-fi shows like Red Dwarf. And with Surfshark, you don't have to stick with what it seems that you've got. But regardless of which side of the pond you're on, just turn on Surfshark either as an app or as a convenient browser extension and check out some of the actually good science fiction that you might not otherwise have access to where you live. Surfshark's Clean Web feature also blocks malware, trackers, and ads to not just keep your browsing safe, but a little bit more hassle-free. So if you're interested, just click the link down below and get 83% off a 2-year plan with Surfshark, plus 3 months absolutely free. That's just over $2 a month for a safer and freer internet experience with access to the sci-fi you love. And speaking of the sci-fi we love, time to talk about the sci-fi we kind of love to hate, as well as the scientism behind a supposed analysis of the Star Wars fandom. First, because I keep using the word, let me define what scientism is. Well, on paper perhaps, scientism is usually just applying science, specifically quantitative methodology, to an area wherein it's not necessarily logical, like philosophy. But moreover, what scientism has developed as a term is to refer to a kind of worshipping of science, or at least a deference towards things that are presented as scientific. Someone disagrees with you on the internet? Well, just say that studies show that person is dumb, and suddenly it becomes true, at least true in the public consciousness. And the classic Milgram obedience study showed us the dangers of scientism, of how much someone just dressed up in a lab coat can affect people's behavior. But because scientism isn't actually about science, for this reason it doesn't seek to uncover truths about reality, but rather just to prove a point, often a political point, and builds the science around proving that point rather than starting with a hypothesis, the null of which one can never fail to reject. That is, those who follow scientism have already precluded any hypotheses that they make are accurate and seek to warp data to ensure rejection of the null. This is because presenting something as scientific essentially is an appeal to authority, as most of us aren't scientists, so if we hear that a study found something, it's easy to defer to whatever we're told the findings of that study are without looking into the methods. That is first and foremost what Rewriting Ripley is evoking here. Scientism, in that they present a bunch of graphs and hope you don't question them, lest you accidentally catch a glimpse of the Raylo behind the curtain. So let's actually pull that curtain back and see what's going on in this supposed data analysis. Rewriting Ripley begins with an assessment of Twitter, intent to prove that the majority of people loved The Last Jedi and that any dislike of the film was either artificial or nominal in scope, and being intent on proving a point are sort of putting the cart before the horse. They present data in the form of this data visualization that seems to indicate that there were more positive tweets about The Last Jedi than negative tweets. So it's obvious then, people loved The Last Jedi and any negativity is minute. But the problem is, the writers start from a false premise, based likely on not conducting a preliminary literature review. And this will become more important as we go forward, but let's quickly discuss what a lit review is. The reasons for a literature review before any kind of research is multifold. While prima facie it may seem like nothing more than a kind of display that the author of a piece of research knows what he or she is talking about, the real reasons for a literature review are to avoid conducting research that has already been published outside of the specific goal of replication, to ensure that there is a theoretical and data-based rationale for which the research is being conducted, to build on existing data, to identify a gap in the wealth of existing research, and to explore unexamined connections or phenomenon. So at step 1, Rewriting Ripley fails in their inability to conduct a basic literature review, because despite their citations, as we'll see, seemingly no one involved has read said citations, nor looked for necessary data to relate their findings to. For example, Ferrara and Yang 2015 found that consistently, tweets with positive emotional valence were significantly more common on the platform than were negative tweets. Specifically, in their breakdown, they identified of all tweets in a network, 45% used neutral words, 34.5% used positive words, and 16% used negative words. This means that in any random analysis of language on Twitter, there is a 2-to-1 positive language use over negative language use. As such, to find a similar breakdown of 2-to-1 positive to negative words in a linguistic analysis of Twitter regarding a particular topic, say The Last Jedi, actually says nothing of particular note or interest about that topic, and instead reflects normative trends on the website. Rewriting Ripley believes that this analysis that they've done is proof that the general public was in favor of The Last Jedi, but these data are actually illustrative of no such conclusion. Instead, all they have done is confirm pre-existing analyses that have found that the total linguistic state of Twitter is typified by a 2-to-1 positive to negative word ratio. Not that one would probably know that by looking at the general state of Twitter, but that is the case. Positivity is actually 2-to-1 more common on Twitter than is negativity. Further, Rewriting Ripley claims that there is a 3-to-1 ratio of positive tweets to negative tweets in response to an initial tweet engagement. That is, they found that when a tweet about The Last Jedi was positive, the responding tweets to that original mention would likely include 3 times more positive than negative words. However, that too has been studied and is a function of normative emotional contagion. This particular effect has been examined in YouTube comments, in that the tone of a parent comment affects and heightens the emotions of children comments in responses. Specifically, Kwon and Grzud 2017 found that a parent comment on a YouTube video about Donald Trump, certainly a topic that inspires at least as much emotional response as a Star Wars film, included an average of 0.41 swear words and resulted in children comments that contained an average of 1.14 swear words. That's an emotional increase of nearly 3.5 times the emotions expressed in the parent as those expressed in the children comments. Thus, this is not evidence that people loved The Last Jedi, but rather that emotions online are contagious and spiral into increasingly expressive emotional verbiage in response to the emotional valence of an original tweet or comment. What Rewriting Ripley has identified is in no way illustrative of a unique effect, indicating that people really loved The Last Jedi and that any dissent towards it is fabricated, but rather they managed to identify a completely normal, average manifestation of comment-based emotional contagion on Twitter. They are looking at completely normal behavior here and treating it as indicative of some greater meaning, like your typical Fedora the Explorer who catches a polite smile from a waitress and takes it as a sign that she wants the D. they are attributing intent from nothing. The numerical breakdown identified here is not limited to Star Wars, but instead is representative of the network-wide trends unrelated to any topic or hashtag, and instead is the normative natural state of Twitter. What Rewriting Ripley has done is not prove that the public actually was incredibly supportive of The Last Jedi on Twitter, but instead that the reaction to The Last Jedi was emotionally laden just as much so as was any random topic on the entire website, like cheeseburgers or the weather. Again, had the people writing this conducted even a cursory analysis, they would be aware that these are the normative states of Twitter. But then again, you wouldn't want objectivity and actual data in a project designed to merely look scientific and not be scientific. Moreover, these results from Rewriting Ripley were obtained by deleting tweets that they determined were false negatives. However, they didn't bother to comb through and manually delete any false positives, only false negatives. That is, even with the data manipulation that they engaged in, which intentionally removed negativity from the dataset, the results of this analysis illustrate that the emotional responses to The Last Jedi on Twitter were no more positive than responses to any random hashtag. Good job.
Pretty impressive that you put so many
data manipulations
and it came out tasting like nothing.
So, when we start from this flawed perception that people really loved The Last Jedi, rather than the reality that people were no more positive nor negative towards it, at least on Twitter, than they are about any given topic, pretty much every subsequent claim made in this report is based on a false premise and will inherently be flawed. For example, moving on to the next segment of the analysis, Rewriting Ripley notes that about 25% of positive tweets, really 23% because they conveniently rounded up, originated from accounts labeled as journalistic, while about 20% of negative tweets, specifically 19 because again they rounded, came from journalistic accounts. Based on the premise that The Last Jedi was generally beloved to a 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1 ratio, which we discussed was inaccurate, then we might expect totally unbiased film reviewers and journalists to be even more positive towards this excellent film than the average degree of positivity manifest in a normative Twitter network. Since, after all, the film was great, and the perception that it was unliked is one artificially created by nasty, negative Fandom Menace people. Thus, you would expect respectable journalists to use 2 or 3 or 4 times as many positive words to describe The Last Jedi than negative words. That was not the case. Negative comments from journalists were 25% less frequent in the system than were positive posts. This is again mostly normative within a social media system wherein negativity, linguistically, is less frequent than positivity. It is not a 2-to-1 nor 3-to-1 relationship, however, indicating that journalists actually used more negative words to describe the film than the typical degree of negativity present in the total network system. That is, journalists were more negative than a completely random sampling of Twitter users, indicating that perhaps the movie was just, bad.
Inconceivable! You keep using the word.
If one were to write a massive document trying to prove that irrelevant posters on the internet have tried to create a false perception that The Last Jedi wasn't a unilaterally beloved film, you would think it would be a major blow to your argument if it turns out that professional journalists and film reviewers are also more negative in their verbiage usage than normative Twitter usage to describe the film. Now, it's important to note that who is a journalist was delineated based only on whether or not the term journalist or a similar related term appeared in the user's Twitter bio. First of all, most of the people in Rewriting Ripley's conspiracy theory chart here are banned from Twitter currently, including the supposed ringleader of all the hatred towards Star Wars, Steve Bannon. But of those not forcibly removed from the platform, the only ones I found who currently use the word journalist to describe themselves are Tim Pool. Just him. Not Ben Shapiro, not Jack Posobiec, not Dave Rubin. None of them publicly identify themselves as journalists on Twitter, all 3 of whom are considered to be spreaders of hate against Lucasfilm or the Star Wars sequels by these authors. The only self-described journalist who could have been included in this assessment then, that illustrated journalists were more negative towards The Last Jedi than the normative Twitter linguistic analysis, is Tim Pool, who contributes about as much spice to the internet Star Wars discourse as he likely does sriracha to his own milk toast. No offense, Tim. In terms of YouTubers who are portrayed as the instigators of anti-Disney, anti-Star Wars hate, let's look specifically at the breakdown to see if YouTubers are really this isolated pocket of vitriol. In terms of negative tweets, YouTubers comprised a total of 47% of those assessed, while YouTubers contributed only 15% positivity towards The Last Jedi. Wow, looks like YouTubers really were the impetus behind the hate based on this analysis of tweets. However, that kind of falls apart when we just look at the number of tweets categorized and start to break down their dataset. That is, there were 29 negative tweets regarding The Last Jedi that came from YouTubers, while there were 32 positive tweets regarding The Last Jedi made from YouTubers. That's right, YouTubers were actually more positive towards The Last Jedi than they were negative. Now, this was around a 1-to-1 ratio, and not the normative 2-to-1 ratio of positivity to negativity seen on Twitter. This is instead evidence that YouTubers disliked the film only slightly more than journalists did. The authors begin to conflate some things at this point, however, in that while they specify that they use the self-descriptor of journalist to determine whether or not an account was a journalist, they gave no indication, at this point, how they determined if an account was alt-right or radical right. But spoiler alert, because they save it for the end, alt-right, according to these authors, is defined as any content wherein, quote, the majority of the account must have been dedicated to pushing right-wing political ideology that included characteristics of alt-right or radical right-wing spaces, including anti-feminist rhetoric and targeting of female creators, targeting of people of color, or use of anti-white language, conspiracy theories, and/or excessive use of Gamergate-era terminology such as SJW, and must be embedded in an alt-right or radical right-wing network, or must be identified primarily as radical right-wing account, be known as a right-wing personality, e.g. Ben Shapiro, or identify as a member of the Fandom Menace. Do you see the conflation? Further, if you notice the term alt-right is included in the definition of alt-right, and that is cyclical logic, and also that there was no mention of actual Wignat ideology, yeah, that's intentional, without any information describing how the authors made this definition to define alt-right this way, their subsequent analyses supplant any and all categorizations made in their first assessment with alt-right or radical right rather than how these individuals personally identified. So the best I can do is theorize about how he or she made this categorization, and if I were to give this person the absolute benefit of the doubt, I would hope they at least used previous data to come to these conclusions. However, they don't cite any previous data in this piece of so-called research. And even if they had, the previous data are highly faulty, with the somewhat now infamous Transparency Tube study basing its own data in its categorization of people as alt-right or whatever, being done by a single individual, Becca Lewis, who based these categorizations on her personal opinions of the political leanings of a channel, and then categorized these channels into who commenters on the channels were also subscribed to as to expand the dataset. That resulted in professional shitposter Sam Hyde's channels all being labeled as white identitarian, and Sue Hulk's cooking channel being labeled as far-right. But somewhat astonishingly, the authors of Rewriting Ripley didn't even bother to seek out that inaccurate analysis. They instead just based it on their own personal opinions rather than looking at someone else's personal opinions. That means this categorization of channels as alt-right boils down to this: they guessed. And given their inability to even articulate this guessing process, I'm using the term guess charitably, because I don't think that charitability was part of their guessing process. That is, they couldn't find the YouTubers that they were looking for, so they had to change around their categorization, which at least if they had conducted a literature review could be based on debunked data, but instead they didn't do, and just base it on their own personal thoughts and feelings. Regardless of these garbage methods, here's what that turned out to be. That is that 23% of negative tweets about The Last Jedi came from alleged alt-right accounts. Wow, sounds like it's a serious problem so long as we don't pay attention to the absolute lack of methodology, and just hope that the writers of this article had some sort of empirical method of determining who was alt-right beyond their own personal feelings. But let's go back and really assess how serious of an issue it would be were these data to be accurate. And again, there's no reason to believe that they are. There were 14 negative tweets made about The Last Jedi from these supposedly alt-right accounts, compared to the total number of positive tweets about The Last Jedi, which from this dataset was 0.06. That is, compared to the total degree of positivity related to The Last Jedi on Twitter, negative tweets from supposedly alt-right users accounted for 6% of messages. Let's be super clear about what just happened here. The Rewriting Ripley authors couldn't find the kind of hatred they wanted to find, so they arbitrarily labeled some users as stormtroopers to further illustrate just how much of an issue these baddies are in the Star Wars fandom. Except even if their categorization was correct, and it's clearly not, it would account for 6% of all tweets, and in the full system, the full analysis, it's 5% of all tweets in reference to The Last Jedi could possibly be attributed to these supposedly alt-right accounts that they themselves gave that label to. To put this into very specific context, the average actual scientific study sets its alpha level at p is less than 0.05, which indicates that in any study, we anticipate up to a 5% margin of error. The total amount of negativity from Twitter accounts that these writers seemingly arbitrarily attributed to politics, therefore, would fall into what in any other social science study would be considered random network noise.
Oh, yes, you're right. Beep is up.
It's also important to note that the author's random categorization of some accounts as alt-right dropped the number of negative tweets from journalists from 19% to 10%. Well, that's convenient. Seemingly all in Rewriting Ripley's favor if they just define a journalist based on their perceptions of their politics. As alt-right, then suddenly journalists are much more positive towards The Last Jedi. Let me be clear, there's a way you could have kind of done that, and that's using inter-rater analysis. But because there's no method specified here, I highly doubt that's the case. So it's just based on their personal opinion. But the results of their incredibly opinionated analysis removed half of all negative journalist tweets from the network. In other words, too many journalists didn't like the film, so the reaction of Rewriting Ripley was to manually categorize half of their negativity towards the movie as alt-right. And why would they do that? Oh, I don't know, maybe to discount their opinions and artificially remove negative reviews from the system by discounting said opinions as wrongthink. For example, one account definitively labeled as alt-right is an account called Remake The Last Jedi, an account that hasn't been really active since about mid-2020. Looking through their Twitter feed, I can find no such basis for this accusation. I could find no mention of race, not white, black, nor Asian, on their entire Twitter profile, and when I reached out to them directly, they disavowed having any political affiliation. I feel bad for this guy or gal who hasn't been active in a year, being kind of forced to come back to see this dumpster fire fingering them as a culprit in something they have nothing to do with. But perhaps that's exactly why Rewriting Ripley pointed this person out, because they did not think they would defend themselves. Moreover, even the Rewriting Ripley authors are seemingly forced to mention, in their own giant blog post, and surely to their own extreme pain, that 3% of negative tweets came from far-left accounts, including Will Menaker, the co-host of the socialist podcast Chapo Trap House. So, given that we have an incredibly biased analysis of data here that we can't take too seriously, that found accounts that the writers themselves had only labeled as alt-right, made up a totality of 5% of negative tweets against The Last Jedi. This exact same flawed data analysis found that far-left users contributed a comparable 3% of negative tweets in relationship to this film. Of course, mere words later, the writers accuse Menaker of misogyny, obviously not in a desperate attempt to disassociate a leftist from their narrative in a self-aggrandizing novel-length post made only to denigrate political opponents, while subsequently mathematically failing to accomplish its precise purpose. But alas, there it is. To reiterate, far-left accounts contributed about 3% of negative tweets about The Last Jedi to this network analysis, versus 5% of accounts that were artificially labeled as alt-right even after the authors could not find the results that they wanted and had to change the data. At some point you have to ask yourself, why did the writers post this? Because right now I'm thinking the Rewriting Ripley contributors must be masochists.
Sounds like someone's posting cringe. It's just a meme, Dick. Sit down.
But with all of that in mind, let's look at their next big data visualization, which shows a massive influx of the alt-right, and with one account, again, the aforementioned non-alt-right account, Remake The Last Jedi, being used as an exemplar of this supposed group, and with YouTubers making up the other large node in so-called alt-right accounts. As mentioned before, the ratio of positive to negative posts from YouTubers was 2 to 1.75, which does illustrate a higher than normative negativity to positivity ratio compared to the standard Twitter network. And while perhaps any average person might assume that this is because the movie is trash, instead, to Rewriting Ripley, this is all devastating evidence of a concerted effort from alt-right accounts to harm Disney, and this is visualized in engagements to tweets, which found that supposedly alt-right accounts, when we know how liberally that label was applied, saw more interaction on Twitter than did comedians, authors, actors, journalists, etc. But the issues here are immediately self-evident. First, in the form that these writers artificially just labeled people like Remake The Last Jedi as alt-right, and secondly, yeah, people whose job is primarily social media tend to have a bit of a bigger influence on social media than traditional media figures. Meanwhile, when we look at positive tweets about The Last Jedi, we see far fewer small independent creators voicing their personal opinions and far more corporations voicing their lack of one. The largest portion of positive tweets in the total network came from randoms, but many others came from actors, musicians, comedians, executives, and journalists. In other words, what Rewriting Ripley is angry about here is that the filthy plebeians had the audacity to dislike a film, and the proof of that is in that journalists and mainstream media figures praise the film. Only when they removed half of the negative reviews from journalists by labeling them as alt-right baddies. And with dirty plebeian YouTubers, half of whom were also artificially labeled with hateful terminology that they themselves deny, disliked the film.
Guilty? Guilty? But there was no trial!
Under the basic principles of English law, every man is innocent until speculated guilty.
Let me be clear what that means. If you dislike The Last Jedi, Rewriting Ripley wants to at least associate you, if not implicate you, in a political ideology, and specifically, they want to emphasize that approved of blue checks with right opinions liked The Last Jedi after they removed half of those negative blue check reviews, while naughty alt-right YouTubers with their uncontrollable opinions disliked it. Perhaps someone should introduce these authors to the concept of psychological reactance. That is, when you tell the plebeians what they can and can't think, they will inherently be driven to think whatever you told them they could not. But again, this goes back to the basic lack of literature review conducted in this so-called analysis. Speaking of which, want to know what comes next in this analysis? I'll give you a Jeopardy countdown. Is it more alt-right nonsense, general toxicity, Rose Tico, or cancel culture? Did you guess Rose Tico? Because that's the winning topic. Because, of course, we must talk about how Kelly Marie Tran supposedly, while no real evidence has ever really been made manifest besides this one screenshot, was harassed off of social media. And who is to blame for that travesty? Well, of course, it's none other than Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro, despite making no mentions of Miss Tran. But the authors have more to say about Miss Tran later. As for now, they move into more of an analysis of YouTube videos. So let's go forward. The initial ratio presented in this assessment of YouTube videos is that for 48 negative videos about The Last Jedi, there were 30 positive videos, a ratio of 1.6 to 1 negative to positive. Now, any other social scientist would look at these data and think perhaps, that's a significantly negative skew versus a typical positive valence skew on the site. However, oftentimes things aren't so complicated as to be a grand conspiracy theory, and again, I would suggest the very real possibility that the film was perhaps just bad. A possibility that Rewriting Ripley never considers. However, let's see what they have to say outside of the apparent impossibility that maybe, just maybe, people didn't like this film. Rewriting Ripley gives us a further glance into their personal beliefs here by giving us a specific list of approved of YouTubers, all of whom had positive takes on The Last Jedi, those being Chris Stuckman, What's Culture, Mr. Sunday Movies, and Kevin Smith. No offense to Kevin Smith, but reaching out to the maker of Yoga Hosers for quality film reviews is a bit like reaching out to Leopold II for advice on a mani-pedi.
Sorry about that!
They specifically note, and this will occur over and over, that only 13% of positive reviews came from creators who also covered gaming content. But the takeaway is, in other words, there are good YouTubers and bad YouTubers, and Rewriting Ripley has just explicitly named who you, as a good Star Wars fan drone, is allowed to listen to because they liked The Last Jedi. And no offense intended from me towards those channels, but considering the links to Lucasfilm that we'll cover at the end, one could surmise that these channels are kind of being promoted by Star Wars officially due to their positive opinions, even if they're not being promoted directly. That is, if you had a negative opinion on the sequels, Disney might be okay with this kind of hit piece trying to label you as a political extremist. But if you publicly promote Disney films, you will be rewarded with a positive mention within said hit piece. But for the interim, let's just say,
every single
critic,
including our friend
Longman,
is now an enemy of
Disney.
Further, the writers really can't help themselves here from going after gamers, and we all know what happens when gamers rise up. Here we can see that the majority of accounts that spoke negatively about The Last Jedi were also gaming accounts. It's almost like YouTubers who are related to media are interested and critical of media, almost like some of us had to suffer through Battlefront 2. I should note that whoever actually wrote this was not absolutely so vacant as to classify red letter media as alt-right, although I would have expected as much, and instead classified what is arguably the longest term, if not longest in length, critic of Star Wars on YouTube as apolitical. There are very few positive things I can say about this supposed analysis, but I guess the fact that they did not label Rich Evans as a white supremacist is the most tepid form of applause that I can apply. Although Red Letter Media contributor Jack Packard appears to have fallen for the grift. Perhaps that's why some, myself of course not included, refer to Jack as AIDS Moby. But just because there was something not completely wrong in this analysis, don't fret because not a paragraph later the authors accuse PewDiePie of being a racist anti-Semite and then conflate this with his negative opinion towards The Last Jedi. They of course bring up the joke video wherein he paid random people on Fiverr to see just what kind of unreasonable stuff they would be willing to do for a couple of bucks, like dance around with a sign containing an anti-Semitic phrase, which they did and which he was clearly shocked by in reaction. As well as the fact that, yes, he once did say the N-word.
What can I say except the N-word?
From this disparagement of my boy Pewds, who despite all this trash talk, they actually do ultimately label as apolitical, indicating all of that previous complaining was just bloviating, or perhaps fear of his lawyers, they immediately complain about a video from a YouTuber called Vito. Why? Because he follows Jack Posobiec on Twitter. But wait, it gets dumber. Because in their critique of Ben Shapiro disliking the film, they note Shapiro claims it moves away from Christian values that shaped America, while interestingly not noting that Ben is a Jewish man and not exactly a goose stepper. I mean, hell, he's not that tall, so maybe he just can't goose step that high.
Because there's just something about racism that's funny. When it's tiny, you know?
Further, they disparage his and other critics' use of the term Mary Sue to describe Rey.
Mary Sue?
Which they describe as, quote, an effort to dismiss her legitimacy in the narrative, rather than recognize this as ancient internet terminology, funnily enough, which originated from a Star Trek fanfiction, and was developed to describe a seemingly perfect female character who faces no hardship within the narrative, of course also without recognizing the existence of its antithetical term, Gary Stu, used to describe a seemingly perfect male character who faces no hardship within the narrative. Mary Sue and Gary Stu are just two sides of the same obnoxious coin and not sexist inherent. The next target of Rewriting Ripley is a channel called IDR Labs, a channel with 40,000 subscribers who hasn't uploaded in nearly a year. Why do they make mention of this relatively small channel? Well, because it's, according to the authors, a channel that promotes, quote, anti-feminist hate and general negativity about The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens, along with videos on anti-Marxist conspiracies and short videos against socialism. Are you starting to see what the issue here that the authors have with this channel? Because they take time out of their long diatribe to complain about a single, small channel that is not promotive of socialism and is also critical of The Last Jedi. Do you think maybe they have a political bent while complaining about non-extant political bents of others? They also are upset about the personality tests available on the IDR Lab website. I do not personally endorse personality tests. They can be fun to take, but even the Myers-Briggs, which is used by a bunch of organizations, is scarcely more than a horoscope. The tests on IDR Labs are just that. They're mostly horoscopes, meaningless self-affirmations. Rewriting Ripley further mentions that Facebook banned the use of these harmless personality tests. I suppose they believe that's some sort of proof of the vile nature of quizzes of this type. But there are no data provided as evidence, and given that there is irrefutable evidence that Facebook intentionally, emotionally manipulates its users, as seen in a classic piece of data from Kramer, Gilroy, and Hancock 2004, who actively were able to alter the emotional valence of posts seen on the website, then I'm sorry, I don't think you can claim that Facebook banning dumb horoscope quizzes is somehow beneficial to the psychological health and well-being of users on the exact same website that actively manipulates the emotions of said users. They also state that no tests on this website are based on scientific research, when multiple tests, just looking at these dumb horoscopes, list the name of scholars from which their surveys are based. Again, I'm not supporting this site nor personality tests, but to claim that these are not based on any kind of scientific battery is a claim that is so easy to debunk that when in collaboration with all of the other ridiculous claims made within this document, at points I am forced to stop and question if this entire thing is a damn joke.
Is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke?
Considering that they combed through the many tests on this website just to highlight one titled, "How Fascist Are You?", such as to make an inference about IDR Labs politics, should alone be indicative of the intentions here from Rewriting Ripley, while they conveniently ignore a test called "How Communist Are You?", all to disparage a website, all because the owner doesn't like The Last Jedi on YouTube. To me, this doesn't seem like science. This seems like a bully who is confident they won't get caught nor in trouble for bullying. Perhaps because they have mainstream backing, or perhaps because they didn't expect a sped like myself to actually look at what they published. But I digress. Besides the manual classification and labeling of these channels as alt-right, why is Rewriting Ripley so angry at these specific YouTubers? And let's go through their critiques line by line. First, these channels supposedly spread the opinions that, quote, Kathleen Kennedy ruined Star Wars by allowing women to work in too many creative jobs at Lucasfilm. Most of the people in this community that I know don't care about women working at Lucasfilm because they are women. They tend to dislike Kathleen Kennedy because of how she has handled the Star Wars IP, not because of her sex. Not to mention that Kennedy didn't bother to use any of the existing expanded universe female characters, such as Mara Jade or Darth Talon, let alone the Force gods like Aboleth, and instead focused the IP on a new character who is, regardless of issues with the term, pretty much a classic Mary Sue. Oh, and don't you worry, because at least according to rumors, Disney is intent on adding more Mary Sues against which you can compare Rey. This is a complaint that also seemingly intentionally erases women like that Star Wars girl, Jay Longbone, and countless others just because the Rewriting Ripley authors don't like that their opinions run contrary to Rewriting Ripley's own pro-corporate narrative. Moving on then, the next concerning opinion is, quote, Rian Johnson ruined Star Wars by emasculating Luke Skywalker. Emasculating is perhaps a term one could use, but not the only word I would use for the total disrespect shown to Luke, who is depicted as a green milk drinking nihilist. But yes, among many things, I suppose emasculating is a term one could use. The next problematic opinion is, quote, creating the character of Rose Tico. No one cares about Rose Tico, and that's perhaps the problem. But specifically, they don't care about her because she's a female, nor because the actress is Asian. They don't like her because she's a non-character, and to this day, as I mentioned before, there is scant evidence that Kelly Marie Tran received any more hate than any random public figure on the internet. And when this Instagram image is the only supposed proof of her harassment, I'm sorry, I get that much harassment. If she did receive more, I'm sorry, but this is not atypical for a public figure in the media. The real public reaction to Rose Tico is that she was a pointless addition who actually stepped on Finn's character development. And perhaps that is a fate worse than death for an attention seeker, that her character was just not as well liked as others. Finally, the last supposed issue is, quote, letting Rey win a lightsaber fight before going through an extensive training montage. And, well, yeah, guess what? Finally, and congratulations, Rewriting Ripley, you have identified a real complaint common within the Fandom Menace. Most of us didn't appreciate a character who faced no challenges because she was naturally perfect at everything. Luke didn't become a badass Jedi Knight instantly after leaving Dagobah and being trained by Yoda. Rey isn't trained by anyone, and yet is instantly a Jedi Master, able to best Kylo Ren with a lightsaber and have incredible control over Force powers. Of course, seeing a character succeed without effort is unappealing to an audience of human beings who, first of all have to put in effort to be good at anything for the most part, and secondly, who have culturally, and by that I mean universally culturally, adapted around the concept of the hero's journey, identified by Dr. Joseph Campbell. To explicate, Campbell found that pretty much every human culture possesses a cultural mythos that includes a story of a heroic figure, and across these cultures, even cultures that lack a written language and have relayed these stories via oral tradition, a hero almost unilaterally must go through a period of hardship and struggle. In media psychology, we can actually see this effect via excitation transfer theory, initially developed by the father of media psychology, Dr. Dolph Zillman, back in 1974. First, subjects watch a short clip from a film that was either exciting or calm and featured a negative or positive interaction between characters. Afterwards, all subjects watched a short clip from the film The Family Way, wherein a husband and wife argue, ending in the husband threatening to leave his wife. Ratings of participant emotions were measured before and after the exposure to these clips, and they found more intense emotional investment in the subsequent film following exposure to the negative films rather than the positive ones. That is, we are more emotionally involved when we have seen something sad beforehand. In line with the hero's journey and excitation transfer theory, we require hardship and struggle in order to be more emotionally invested in the story and the characters. I don't really know why there isn't more contemporary data on what I consider to be a foundational theory in media psychology, that being excitation transfer, but what it predicts is that it is important, if not necessary, for the emotional investment of viewers to see a character be challenged so that when they later succeed, emotional stress at their suffering transfers into joy and jubilation at their success. People don't like seeing Rey win without struggling because the excitation of struggle transfers onto happiness when we see a protagonist finally win. But regardless, Rewriting Ripley comes to the following conclusions about anyone who doesn't like the Star Wars sequels on YouTube, and that is as follows. A continuation of Gamergate, a culture of grifters who play an active role in alt-right radicalization. If that caused you to have an aneurysm, just hold on because it does get worse. Isn't it funny how Gamergate is still being blamed for random crap 5 or 6 years later, totally organically, and not because it's a boogeyman for people who legitimately have no argument, to such an extreme point that they publish so-called data to prove the opposite of their point while crying about how it proves their point? Well, if Star Wars fans weren't already insulted enough, guess who's next? Did you guess people who play video games? Well, good, because of course they were the next target for the Puritans at Rewriting Ripley. So let's talk about freaking Gamergate in 2021. The authors further begin to connect the dots between the Fandom Menace and Gamergate by linking to a Gamma Sutra article that states gamers should not be the audience for the gaming industry, because, quote, gamers are over, and as evidence, quote, games culture is a petri dish of people who know so little about human social interaction and professional life that they can concoct online wars about social justice or games journalism ethics, straight-faced, and cause genuine human consequences, because of video games. This is being referenced in a wordy post about toxic Star Wars fandom, relating it to real-world politics, and yet the authors have the absolute temerity to cite an article that criticizes others for being bad at social interaction and taking a hobby to real-life extremes. Just a bit ironic, I'd say. Don't you think? Now, this is a place where these lads have really irritated me because I am first and foremost a games communication scholar, and as such it is imperative that I rebut their claims with data, but first we need to look at these claims. They note that 53% of channels that were negative towards The Last Jedi also made video game related content, and therefore could be associated with Gamergate. Seen here in their visualization of titles from YouTubers who reported negatively on The Last Jedi, we can see that the word game appears frequently in the word cloud. So before we move forward, I want to address the idea that games or gamers cause violence, and that games are in some way associated with violence or radicalization, because that is the implication being made here by the Rewriting Ripley authors, that gamers are violent, evil baddies. An argument long ago touted by the religious right and now being touted by these apparent pro-socialist Raylos. So is any of this true? Well, what I would consider to be the definitive academic debate, at least as of now, on this subject occurred about a decade ago between two groups of researchers in what I believe to be the greatest academic rap battle of modern time, and that is Anderson et al. Versus Ferguson et al. It would be difficult to fully explicate in a short form or format the true depths of the ongoing fit between the Anderson and Ferguson camps, but let's just cover the big hits. In 2007, Ferguson published a study that suggested that the research on the relationships between gameplay and aggression was heightened via meta-analytic methods that did not actually represent reality. This complaint was further compounded by complaints with inherent issues in the measure of aggression. Keep in mind, ethically, we cannot measure whether or not exposure to games or anything else causes violence. So instead, we must operationalize this measurement through the concept of aggression. How do we ethically measure aggression? Well, typically in most cases by allowing participants to ostensibly play a loud noise in the headphones of another supposed participant. None of this actually happens, it's all just research play pretend, but subjects are made to believe that they are playing screamo into the other subject's ear holes. Ferguson's 2007 analysis indicated moderator effects. That is, individual factors were more influential even in this measurement of aggression than was game exposure, in large part in response to previous research from the Anderson cohort team. A few years later, Anderson et al. 2010 released a meta-analysis that was intended to prove that games did cause increased aggression, but again relied on the aforementioned faulty methods criticized in Ferguson, which only compounded in a meta-analytic methodology, and was the exact critique that Ferguson had made 3 years prior. And yet Ferguson's issues were themselves critiqued in the Anderson 2010 study. Why? Because Anderson said Ferguson should have included non-published data in his analysis. Research that primarily, guess what, originated almost exclusively from the Anderson research cohort, yet had not been accepted for academic publication. And when including conference papers, the number of documents excluded from Ferguson's assessment of the relationship between games and aggression in their total meta-analysis of games and aggression was 75% unpublished papers that came directly from the Anderson et al. Research program. As seen here in the graph from Ferguson et al.'s 2010 response, we can see that as game sales have increased, violent youth offenders has decreased. While a mere correlation, this contradicts the narrative that people who play games become radicals, which the Rewriting Ripley document is pretty clearly implying, following in the footsteps of not just Anderson et al., but also esteemed former lawyer Jack Bruce Thompson. Moreover, the Ferguson data indicate a negative relationship between game sales and violence at a degree stronger than the positive relationship between criminal behavior and genetic influences on antisocial personality issues, the community crime levels, and owning a firearm. In response, Anderson, who chose very specifically not to be first author in their response, and let me be clear to those outside of academe, one only chooses not to be first author because they're either helping out a new scholar, or because they're ashamed of the paper they're about to published, published a response filed under Bushman, Rothstein, and Anderson 2010 in what I can only describe as a limp-wristed opinion piece to strike back at Ferguson's meta-analysis, which is basically just an excuse for their own bad practices, all while kind of subtly implying that the Ferguson group are bad because they like video games. But the point is, gamers are not violent inherent due to being gamers. Probably any journal article you'll come across that claims anything to the contrary is going to be citing Anderson et al. 2010. A study which was so thoroughly debunked and dabbed upon that Anderson then had to go get his associate to cry about it as lead author without providing any real scientific refutation to Ferguson and their cohort. Get dunked on, Anderson.
Stepping over the charred corpses of their foes, and again turning to the camera to remind the now grieving parents of their dead enemies that this is what happens when you let your sons play with killers.
I made this long mention of all of that to make it clear that gamers are not inherently violent, and the fact that Rewriting Ripley is parodying the same kind of rhetoric as Jack Thompson, implying there is a crossover between gaming, disliking Star Wars, radical right-wing politics, and violence in the same way that Christian conservatives would have 15 years ago, would be hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. But as further proof of this overlap between the kind of nasty people who like video games and therefore are violent, and the alt-right and Star Wars criticism, the authors present this word cloud. They complain about the term SJW, saying it's an alt-right term used to denigrate anyone who advocates for diversity in media, when no, it's not. SJW is just shorthand for extremist progressive politics, and I do find it quite amusing that this piece brandishes the word alt-right to describe anyone who dislikes Star Wars, yet cannot even accept that SJW has any meaning whatsoever beyond being a cudgel with which to criticize the left, while doing the exact same thing with the term alt-right over and over and over in this piece. The hypocrisy is truly something to behold. Remember, once again, the authors decided completely based on their own opinion who this definition applied to, when any real scientific analysis would have used interators who are unfamiliar with the research and would have been asked to determine whether or not this definition applied to these channels. None of that happened, so all of this is based entirely on the opinion of two authors with no interator reliability, no accountability, and no indication or even a pretense of objectivity, despite all being presented as a scientific analysis. But who all in this supposed analysis of YouTubers was specifically identified as alt-right via these clearly flawless methodologies? Well, it's FilmGob, Robot Head, Mauler, That Star Wars Girl, Midnight's Edge, Clownfish TV, World Class Bullshitters, SC Reviews, RK Outpost, The Daily Wire, The Critical Drinker, Just Some Guy, Robert Frank 615, IDR Labs, Overlord DVD, Thor Skywalker, Bishop Robert Bannon, and Geeks and Gamers. Interestingly, these are all accounts that have had negative opinions toward The Last Jedi, while almost every positive sentiment from any YouTuber just happened to be labeled as other in their affiliation. That includes Jenny Nicholson, for example, who I would say has had some left-leaning political opinions. But do you see the issue with this kind of categorization? There is no left-leaning political orientation assessed, only alt-right, gaming, or other. And as for the term alt-right, well, under a typical definition that would probably include an emphasis on white identitarianism, Rewriting Ripley does not utilize this classification, and instead defines essentially anyone who critiques anything vaguely left as inherently alt-right. Thereby, this document labels an African American like Just Some Guy or Geeks and Gamers who employ several non-white staff members as alt-right. But despite labeling non-white creators as alt-right, Rewriting Ripley makes specific note of any video that uses the term white in their title or thumbnail. Yeah, that's right, while accusing black people of being white identitarians and defining wide swaths of people as racist, the authors are simultaneously concerned with the use of the word white. They also highlight any criticism of feminism as sexist, including the criticism of Kathleen Kennedy for promoting a feminist agenda, while having the plucky audacity to follow up that claim with thumbnails of pictures of Kathleen Kennedy in a Force is Female t-shirt. No, Kathleen Kennedy obviously doesn't have a feminist agenda, and Rewriting Ripley proves it by including these images, reaching new lows in terms of levels of self-awareness that perhaps have never before been witnessed. These writers are the kind of people who would argue there are 5 lights. So to prove these horrible externally labeled alt-right accounts were bullying Kathleen Kennedy, they provide the following graph, which maybe to someone who's never looked at a graph before might look like all of these baddies make a lot of videos critical of Kathleen Kennedy, illustrating the hate she receives from these alt-right radicals. Except, unless you're easily distracted by the names of the channels that they've labeled as the bad guys in bright red, the data do not betray Rewriting Ripley's conclusion, so let's actually assess the statistical breakdown here. The channel Mike Zero, labeled as Other, has posted 203 videos mentioning Kathleen Kennedy, while the second most videos about Kennedy came from Geeks and Gamers, who posted 1/5 as many videos related to the president of Lucasfilm. In toto, based on the data they themselves present, videos about Kathleen Kennedy that might have been negative because they arise from one of these haphazardly labeled accounts, slapped with that description seemingly at whim as alt-right, with no interator reliability, by these two authors, produce about half as many videos about Kathleen Kennedy as do channels the authors did not attribute a political belief to. So at this point, I think it should be clear this is not science, but scientism, a political belief dressed up as science whose visage is as a pig in a dress, which quickly becomes apparent under the slightest of scrutiny. So the question is now,
why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
What are the motives behind Rewriting Ripley? Is it really to prevent people from going down an alt-right rabbit hole? Well, let's look at that supposed rabbit hole and to what end this document has been produced. As soon as these authors have labeled these channels with zero methodological stringency as alt-right, what do they do next? What is the purpose of this massive post, and thereby this massive video, I guess? Well, of course, it's to attack the creators' rice bowl, complaining about how much money these people make on YouTube. To come to these conclusions, the authors guess how much money a YouTuber makes based on the average pay per 1,000 views, which astonishingly they actually note is highly inaccurate, only to ignore that fact and publish this graph of projected earnings anyway. Of course, there is nothing in this extremely simplistic analysis that could account for demonetization, which happens all the time, so already this is majorly inflated, and further, any YouTuber can tell you that what YouTube says they pay is usually far higher than what they actually pay, and views don't equal dollars because a lot of people don't turn off that pesky ad block. But knowing what these people don't really make is only of interest to Rewriting Ripley because they propose that the more a channel makes, the more popular it is, and thereby the more dangerous the channel is in radicalizing viewers with their unoperationalized, non-iterator ratified definition of alt-right. So let's look at that supposed pipeline. The Rewriting Ripley authors propose that people radicalized by Comicsgate and Gamergate go onto YouTube to complain about being oppressed or about the degradation of culture and media, and when users watch these videos, they become dragged into a rabbit hole that leads them to videos of misogyny, racism, and even fascism. As evidence of this rabbit hole, the writers point to a quote from former YouTube engineer Yame Chaslot, who laments how the algorithm could lead people down a potentially dangerous road by seeking to serve the interests of users. Except, that's not actually how the algorithm works, and Chaslot specifically knows better, so I find it really fantastic that they quoted him, because he published a paper on it in 2020 under Fadul, Chaslot, and Fareed. They sought to see if this YouTube rabbit hole actually really did exist, and did that with an algorithmic analysis that could identify the content of a video itself with only 78% accuracy. Meaning that, for example, it might have a hard time determining if a video was in favor of Star Wars or negative towards it based on the language used, including things like sarcasm, which artificial intelligence almost always struggles to account for. In January of 2019, so at perhaps the peak of the Fandom Menace, occurring 11 months before the release of The Rise of Skywalker, YouTube made a change in its algorithm to demote conspiratorial and politically extremist videos. Before the change in the algorithm, the likelihood of being recommended a conspiracy video from a conspiracy source was 70%, and after the changes, this dropped to 23%. This means that if these videos were truly lanes that led to some kind of alt-right rabbit hole, the algorithm would majorly decrease the likelihood that someone would come across that content, and further cut views to any kinds of potential misogynistic or racist videos that the authors of Rewriting Ripley are so concerned about. Moreover, the Fadul et al. Analysis found that politically related content was the least likely to be served out of this dataset, with videos related to QAnon being served to 12% of people who were specifically looking for them. In contrast, YouTube did not stop recommending videos about aliens or flat earth conspiracies, but definitely cracked down on politically related conspiracies, despite the fact that research from the very guy they are quoting contradicts Rewriting Ripley's statements. They continue to say that watching a Geeks and Gamers video recommended them a video from D-Day Cobra, which is the personal channel of Jeremy from Geeks and Gamers, who they have labeled as an alt-right guy. Why? Because he titled a video, quote, "The media is the enemy of the people," presumably for promoting falsehoods, while they themselves, a supposedly media group, because as we'll see they have ties to the mainstream media, promote falsehoods. Similarly, the authors who, to their very minor credit, do not label Tim Pool as alt-right himself, still sully his name by noting he has ties to people at InfoWars, and through this connection, tie him to the events of January 6th in a beautiful display of guilt by association. Continuing this trend, the authors also mention how Ethan Van Sciver has plugged Jordan Peterson's books, and then denigrate Peterson by describing him as, quote, "especially dangerous because he disguises highly subjective and damaging transphobic, homophobic, racist, and misogynist ideology as self-help and reason for young men." And while they admit Peterson does not associate with the alt-right, the fact that he has fans who might be members of the Proud Boys, and the fact that Ethan has promoted his book, is somehow, to Rewriting Ripley, proof of this affiliation.
Free speech is the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning. Woo! It's as a consequence of free speech and the ability to speak that people can put their finger on problems, articulate what those problems are, solve them, and come to a consensus.
But wait, it still gets worse. Next, the authors cite a tweet from Itchy Baka, supportive of the Proud Boys, made on January 6th, and noting many YouTubers have referenced tweets from Itchy Baka, while conveniently leaving out the reason why they tend to mention this account. Moreover, Itchy Baka was once suspended from Twitter for being critical of racism and sexism in the fandom, and has made multiple comments on how he believes there is no such thing as scientific differences between the human races. But alas, this is the kind of person Rewriting Ripley uses as proof of racism in the Fandom Menace. By the way, as an act of kindness towards Rewriting Ripley, Itchy Baka deleted his blog after they personally requested that he do so, only for them to not accept the gesture, so he brought it back. Just goes to show how the people behind this project are not interested in anything other than the utter and complete destruction of anyone who doesn't like Disney Star Wars. Despite Itchy Baka's personal disavowal of racism long before taking down his own blog, this does not prevent Rewriting Ripley from dedicating several paragraphs in their own blog wherein they compare his criticisms of anti-white and anti-Christian sentiments to those promoted by VDARE, a group which has been labeled as white supremacist by the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. So even though this guy says he hates racism, has been suspended for saying he hates racism, just because he says he thinks one could be racist against white people or intolerant towards Christians, that puts him on par with VDARE for the Rewriting Ripley authors. Just to be clear, this means that if a racist and an anti-racist person come to the same conclusion about any given topic, let's say 2 + 2 = 4, although we know that basic mathematical equation is politically valenced nowadays, the authors of Rewriting Ripley would say that the anti-racist is actually a racist because they agreed that 2 + 2 = 4. Now, despite the fact that Rewriting Ripley previously showed us that positive tweets about The Last Jedi were technically more common than negative ones, something in line with normative Twitter linguistic patterns, and that videos from people they arbitrarily labeled as alt-right regarding Kathleen Kennedy were half as frequent as those from neutral accounts, the authors still somehow need to explain why these videos and tweets and sentiments are popular, despite previously trying to show how they weren't popular. To do this, they point to a study from Bay 2018, which, hey, is at least some more data we can look at, but I don't think it's going to work out in their favor. Dr. Bay collected a data set of 967 tweets directed towards Ryan Johnson, the sentiments of which he manually determined, once again suspiciously with no inter-raters. But he found that most tweets were pretty overtly either negative or positive with little nuance. That is, to be fair, kind of a part of what inherently comes with the platform being limited to 280 characters, so I'm actually kind of willing to accept Bay's manual review, at least at this stage, to a degree. But he quickly loses my academic goodwill when he also manually categorizes Twitter accounts into 3 types: political agenda, troll sock puppet bot, and real fantagonists, which he accomplishes by looking at other tweets from these accounts. Political accounts were categorized as those who used words like Trump or SJW. Real fantagonists were those that didn't post any politically related content. Finally, sock puppet or troll or bot accounts were determined using an existing program that detects bot activity. Further, he categorized trolls, and not without citation, as those who posted more than 50 tweets a day, with low follower ratios, who used default profile settings, made short tweets, and often used variations on a name of another person, often a celebrity or public figure, or a long string of numbers or letters following the name. But here comes the issue. To identify these Russian trolls, Bay cites Xanato 2018, a study I have thoroughly and excruciatingly covered in its methodological flaws. So while I would recommend watching my entire video on that for an in-depth analysis of why their methods are inaccurate, I don't have the time here to reiterate all of the issues with Xanato's study because that's another hour-and-a-half long video, and this video is long enough as is. But put simply, Xanato did not identify Russian bots with his study in any kind of reasonable way beyond what time of day, maybe, some people were posting to Twitter, and even that was incredibly spurious. Any analysis based on a bad analysis is going to have issues then, so off the bat, Bay, if he is following Xanato, which he is, is not identifying many real Russian bots, if any at all. So with that in mind, what did Bay find? Well, first that only 22% of tweets were negative towards The Last Jedi. Remember that the average emotional valence of Twitter is 2-to-1 positivity to negativity, and 3-to-1 positivity when assessing specifically tweets made in response to positive parent comments. Thus, a 22% level of negativity is perhaps a little bit lower than normative, but not significantly. He further elaborates, however, that when removing Twitter accounts that mention politics, or were identified as trolls or bots using, again, what we know are faulty methods, only then did negative tweets represent 10.5% of the messages, which is statistically aberrant. But Dr. Bay had to use bad data analysis to come to that conclusion in his assessment of a dataset that was otherwise generally representative of Twitter negativity. To reiterate, Bay found that people were about as negative towards The Last Jedi on Twitter as they are towards anything else, and the only way that he could reduce that normative dataset was by personally categorizing a bunch of people as bots and trolls, using flawed methods to discount users as Russians. If Bay's research were completely legitimate, and it's not, then his conclusion that only 10.5% of negative messages were legitimate would actually be an indication of artificial inflation of positive emotions, potentially from bots, rather than representative of the natural state of Twitter. How incredibly fascinating that a piece of research designed to show that Last Jedi negativity is caused by bots, if true, would logically be better evidence for the existence of pro-Last Jedi bots, and that Last Jedi positivity is more likely related to unusual Twitter activity. And that actually is particularly likely given how blue checkmark journalist accounts were more negative towards the movie. What Dr. Bay's data actually show, if we believe his categorization, is that pro-Last Jedi sentiment bears a greater resemblance to botting activity than anti-Last Jedi sentiment. I don't have the words to describe this kind of level of self-own. You thought you published a paper about unusual negative activity on Twitter that you attribute to bots, but actually provided evidence that positive behavior related to The Last Jedi is likely more attributable to botting activity. Absolutely brilliant. But wait, there's still more, because now the Rewriting Ripley authors cite a study of Star Wars Twitter usage from Bethany Lucina, which does not appear to have been published outside of her own personal website. So I can only assume it's not peer-reviewed, and given the overall state of this document, well, let's just say that doesn't surprise me. The author looked at tweets made around the time when Kelly Marie Tran quit Twitter that mentioned Star Wars, The Last Jedi, Tran, or Rose Tico, as well as mentions or replies to Star Wars-related podcasters. First, she identified tweets by looking at 23 podcasts on StarWars.com and broke down the hosts by gender, by, yes, assuming their gender, which will be an ongoing theme here, because when explicating how she determined if respondents to these podcasts were themselves male or female, her response was, "I guessed." Beautiful methodology. She then ran these tweets through an algorithm used to detect hate speech, which includes threats of violence and offensive words developed by SPD. Now, I'll be real with you, some of these terms are undeniably offensive, but the list also includes terms like married, white, black, dirty, lame, and, shorty bitch.
I love you, bitch. Oh my God. I ain't gonna never stop loving you, bitch.
But don't worry, if Lucina came across a tweet she didn't think was really hateful in her unpublished research, she just removed it from the analysis. So yeah, the following data are completely legit and not artificially created by the author. Regardless, she found that 73% of tweets about The Last Jedi used negative language. Well, that completely disagrees with all of the previous data that we've looked at. But of those that included offensive language, which was similar, ranging between 5% of all tweets to 6.9% of negative-only tweets, hate speech, again operationalized interestingly, occurred in only 1% of these messages. Tweets about Rose Tico in general contained offensive language in 12% of all messages and 18% in specifically negative tweets. The hate speech words in these tweets ranged from a general level of 1.8 to 2.8% in those explicitly negative. Further, there was some minor evidence that women podcasters receive more negative tweets, with general offensive tweets ranging from 7.7 for men to 8.5 for women, and when only assessing negative and offensive tweets, men's proportion was 12% while women's was 17%. However, men received 16% more negativity on average than women on Twitter. All that really matters here, though, is that Lucina seemed to find that people generally did not like The Last Jedi in her very biased analysis, but her analysis completely contradicts with that of Bay and Rewriting Ripley. So which are we supposed to believe? I would say probably none of them, and instead relied on generalized Twitter negativity data from scholars without a scientism bent and a political axe to grind like Ferrara and Yang. Also, it's frankly bizarre that Rewriting Ripley would cite side by side two completely contradictory studies, one of which finds anger towards The Last Jedi is so uncommon that it represents an atypical Twitter environment to the point it would indicate pro-TLJ botting, and another that found 73% of tweets about TLJ were negative in valence, which potentially could suggest a conclusion to the contrary. Immediately after bringing up these two conflictory pieces of research, Rewriting Ripley further points out that honest trailers claim that their Last Jedi trailer got 1,500 negative comments, and Rewriting Ripley, without any rationale, posits that those were real hateful comments, while just sentences beforehand claiming that the online hate towards The Last Jedi was all Russian bots.
Doesn't anyone notice this? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
The next claim is that YouTube and Facebook spread fake news, a claim I have previously addressed in that YouTube specifically demotes QAnon content, which Rewriting Ripley directly blames for downvotes on advertisements shown on the platform from Marina Abramovich, which received 24,000 dislikes. Of course, there couldn't be any organic reason for that response. Further, they complained about downvotes on videos from black creators, just paragraphs after accusing black creators of being alt-right. Similarly, the authors claim that disliking The Last Jedi, which they can't decide is legitimate or illegitimate, resulted in review bombing. Now, as I think I've exposed, there's nothing inherently political about this film that would result in a review bomb, but politics sure was a reason for which journalists actually review bombed Run, Hide, Fight, financed by the Daily Wire, and which sits at a 13% on Metacritic, despite a Rotten Tomatoes audience score of 93%. While official accounts and journalists gave Run, Hide, Fight a 44%, audiences gave The Last Jedi a similar 42% on Rotten Tomatoes. But while these sites seemingly have no intention to step in on the behalf of Run, Hide, Fight, removing negative reviews seemingly arbitrarily, following the negativity expressed by audiences in response to another stinker, Captain Marvel. In other words, as an expression of how oppressed all these regulos are by the vile alt-right trolls, Rewriting Ripley admits that Rotten Tomatoes deleted negative reviews, and that might have been politically motivated, yet expresses no such concern for films like Run, Hide, Fight, negative reviews of which were undoubtedly and openly politically motivated. But here's where the authors really begin their denouement, by stating that you can be spreading hate and online radicalization without realizing it by talking about The Last Jedi. How? Well, it's clearly illuminated by liberal Mark Hamill retweeting a Luke Skywalker tribute video from a guy who had questions about the 2020 presidential election. Listen, ladies, I know this is maybe hard to understand, but just because Mark Hamill plays a space wizard in a film doesn't mean he actually has the powers of precognition. The authors immediately move on from this topic to not only reify that they are furious about a mere fourth of tweets being negative towards this film by their analysis, or potentially more than that, dependent on the citation they're mentioning in the moment, but they also state they just aren't interested in why people may have disliked the film, only on what baseless political ramifications that disliking the film might have had, based on their own political labeling of others. For this reason, they go on to lament how successful the supposed alt-right has been, which is why the Democrats completely control the US politic currently. Oh wait, that probably messes up the narrative. So let's look more at theirs. The authors next mention a distaste towards Rian Johnson and blame this distaste on what else but the alt-right, because of course they do. We already discussed how absurd their very personal categorization technique is, so keep that in mind. But even when they have falsely labeled channels as alt-right, here are their findings. 45% of YouTube videos mentioning Rian Johnson were what these authors artificially labeled as alt-right, but let's break this down by channel. 36% of mentions of Rian Johnson came from the neutral channel Mike Zero. 15% of mentions came from Geeks and Gamers, again, a channel run by a diverse crowd of people but labeled arbitrarily as alt-right here, and 7% of mentions came from Clownfish TV, who are a self-described left-leaning couple, but again were mislabeled by Rewriting Ripley as alt-right.
Our great sin, and the reason we're put on these lists and labeled alt-right, even though we're not even Republican, and being, smeared right and left, is because we dared, put this out there and connect the dots and say, hey, you don't get to call people names.
Further, the authors express irritation at people calling out racists for being racist, because it's okay to be racist against white people. I'm not joking. That's pretty much their argument. But wait, the defense play here is just beginning. Next, the writers support Chuck Wendig, claiming he was fired from Marvel because a hate mob initiated by Ethan Van Sciver went after him for no reason, and not because he could not stop himself from being an incredibly aggressive and generally just awful person on the Bird app, including a call to not be civil towards people who disagree with you politically, and generally being supportive of cancel culture, until his insufferable tweets had the exact effect he demanded of others on him. But apparently, according to Rewriting Ripley, you can be as toxic and nasty as you want on the Bird app, so long as you're being toxic towards the right people, I guess. Moreover, Rewriting Ripley actually has the cojones to then immediately defend James Gunn, who made a bunch of really skeevy tweets, which resulted in him being removed from Guardians of the Galaxy. Once again, the message here is clear. When leftists say actually unhinged or weird things, that's fine, but when people who use the word SJW don't like a movie, then they need to be deplatformed, lest regular people fall down this imaginary alt-right rabbit hole. Finally, now we move into the Rose Tico portion of this incredibly long article and video, which I'll try to cover quickly because we have again never seen any evidence that Kelly Marie Tran was personally harassed any more than any other public figure is on a daily basis. The evidence is, again, just this screenshot from Instagram with people criticizing her character, not her. Once again, they link back to the Lucina analysis, which I've expressed my concerns with, wherein a total of 6% of posts about Tran contained offensive language and hate speech like lame, presumptively, and was 60% more common in tweets made about her than other Star Wars-related topics. But still, to put this into perspective, 6% of tweets about Rose Tico were more negative when the negative state of Twitter is 2-to-1 positivity to negativity in ratio, meaning mentions of Tico massively underrepresented normal negativity to a factor of more than 8 times, less likely than a random Twitter thread about the weather. In terms of videos mentioning her, the most popular video, Why Rose Doesn't Work, comes from an account, Please Rewind, also arbitrarily labeled as alt-right, so even if we were to believe this is a completely subjective categorization, video views still came from channels labeled as non-alt-right at a ratio of 9-to-10, a nearly 50% equal distribution. Their analysis did reveal that Ethan Van Sciver made more videos about Tico than anyone else, but again, even with Rewriting Ripley's biased, subjective categorization of who is alt-right, only slightly more than half of all videos about Tico came from these supposedly alt-right channels. But to bolster their narrative that people were mean to Tran, they highlight a meme video that does nothing more than cut scenes in such a way to look like Rose may have died, and a video where Ethan destroys some crappy Star Wars toys while talking about their poor quality and how no one was buying Rose Tico action figures. A demonstrable fact, by the way. They then quote Ethan from a live stream that the Rewriting Ripley authors themselves were involved in removing from YouTube, accusing him of making an insensitive joke, but again, I can't confirm if he even made that joke because these exact people are the ones that reported it and got it taken down. How convenient and how illustrative that despite claims of alt-right harassment, these writers sure seem awfully determined to go after EVS. The authors continue by being angry that The Rise of Skywalker was apparently less insufferable for fans than The Last Jedi, and they opine on how that's actually a bad thing, including complaints about the scene wherein Luke rebukes Rey throwing away her lightsaber and linking it to who they also describe as an alt-right YouTuber, Critical Drinker's analysis of said scene. They make sure to note that if you like The Rise of Skywalker, you're not necessarily a white supremacist, but you are enjoying a film that was produced from the actions of white supremacist reactionaries. And given the wealth of guilt by association riddled across this document, let's just say I'd bet the authors would categorize you as alt-right if you liked The Rise of Skywalker more than The Last Jedi. I'm not going to belabor this segment, but I do need to point out the issues here raised by Rewriting Ripley are critiques themselves of the Star Wars sequels. The kind of critiques that they have wasted thousands of words labeling as alt-right conspiracies. But as soon as a Space Wizard film doesn't go the way they want, then suddenly it's okay to critique it. The authors also complain about the film's lack of inclusion of Rose Tico and Finn, when had these people bothered to watch any of the long criticisms offered up by the Fandom Menace? They almost all unilaterally wanted more Finn so long as he was a developed Finn, because he was a character probably most disserviced besides Luke by this franchise, as expressed by John Boyega himself.
Fans were like, we wanted Finn to have a bigger part. Finn was put, when it was marketed, you all thought Finn was going to be a Jedi. They had him with the lightsaber. Yep. You're like, oh my god. And then people wanted more Finn. They wanted more Poe too.
Yet despite the fact that what we wanted from Star Wars was just good Star Wars, the authors of Rewriting Ripley assert that The Rise of Skywalker was nothing more than pandering to white supremacists, when many of those supposed supremacists actively wanted Finn to be the main character because he was always more interesting than Rey. And Rewriting Ripley's final proof of how it's evil when people they don't like dislike a film that they like, and also evil when people they dislike a film that they don't like, well, the proof obviously lies in tweets from Ben Shapiro. If you thought this couldn't get more shameful, the authors end this massive document by again blaming none other than Gamergate as the origin of the radicalization that caused people to dislike a movie that they liked. So if you've made it this far, and I know it's been a long journey, I want to briefly discuss the people behind this project, because that has become the big story since the release of this blog, rather than the anti-scientific nature of the document itself, but the people behind it, for better or worse, and I feel therefore it's imperative we briefly talk about the fallout and the drama that's occurred since this document was released. Because who could have possibly imagined that the people who made what I can only describe as a faux scientific hit piece designed to deplatform people who didn't like a movie and spends an entire segment whinging about how much money they think others might make talking about space wizards have weird political and social goals of their own. Because of course they do. Now, let me preface everything I'm about to say with a very strong statement that I'm generally against doxing in almost all cases unless the person has committed some kind of actual crime, because it really only serves one purpose: actual targeted harassment. To try and mess with someone's real life, to get them fired, contact people they know, etc. And so for that reason, I'm not going to use any full names here, and I have to be incredibly clear. Please do not go harass these people or bother them in any way, because frankly they seem bothered enough as it is. The purpose of this video is primarily to address their supposed data. But the reason I have to mention my stance here firstly is because that's a courtesy that the people behind Rewriting Ripley do not share, given that one of the contributors has repeatedly on her personal account, as well as from the Rewriting Ripley account, attempted to deplatform comic artist Pro Secret's Ethan Van Sciver. She encouraged YouTube to remove the video that I mentioned before, destroying the Rose Tico toy, and responded to the subsequent removal of said video by demanding the entire channel be expunged because there's clearly no pleasing this person. Even more recently, she or someone tweeting from the Rewriting Ripley account requested another of Ethan's live streams be taken down that supposedly involved some insensitive jokes, which I mentioned before that I can't confirm because the video was taken down. And speaking of which, it's a bit unusual for YouTube to be this responsive to what is in reality a pretty small Twitter account. However, their response might make more sense as we go forward. So why might it be that YouTube took these complaints so seriously? Let's look at the writers behind Rewriting Ripley. First up, Katie is one of the main contributors to Rewriting Ripley and is also a self-described Reylo, meaning she wants Rey and Kylo Ren to be involved in a romantic relationship, and I mention that because if you want to talk about some supposedly toxic subsections of the Star Wars fandom, I don't think you can avoid talk of Reylos who have notoriously sent threats to Adam Driver's wife to the point where she doesn't even have a social media account, and the couple were forced to keep the birth of their own son secret, knowing how the Reylos would react, with threats and fake accounts designed explicitly to upset their marriage. Why do they hate this family so much? Because it gets in the way of Adam Driver, the actor who plays Kylo Ren in a science fiction film franchise, being in a real-life relationship with Daisy Ridley, the actress who plays Rey in said franchise, such as to make their fantasy relationship a reality. You heard that right. They hate this man's real-world family because these real-world human beings in real human relationships prevent this man from getting involved in a relationship with another woman, all because they play characters in a film who are in a fictional romantic relationship, kind of? I'm sorry, but Reylos don't really get to talk about toxic fandoms, including spending paragraph after paragraph talking about alleged harassment faced by Kelly Marie Tran, when Reylos have done the exact same thing to Adam Driver and his wife. And additionally, at least to me, the very concept of wanting to break up this man's family so he can be involved with another actress removes all agency from everyone involved in this scenario, and it sounds, if I'm being honest, a bit struggle-snuggly. The other half of Rewriting Ripley is Lady V, who, as with Katie, is a Reylo and has made fan art of it. That is, the two creators behind the supposedly statistical analysis of toxic fans are both themselves arguably toxic fans. in a fan base whose obsessive hatred of a man's family forced him to hide the very existence of his own son. Further, Katie allegedly collected thousands of tweets of people being mean to Reylos or critical of the Reylo fandom, presumably with the intent to try and cancel those who spoke negatively about the fictional pairing. And to give you an idea of one of the most despicable things posted by these anti-Reylo accounts, so heinous that clearly prestigious journalistic outlet Bitch Media felt the need to highlight it, is, quote, "You haven't seen this many acne-riddled, fatty Tumblr girls lose their shit since Twilight ended." Clearly a tweet deserving of cataloging. I'm bringing this all up because it's more than a bit hypocritical for Katie and Lady V or whoever else is posting from Rewriting Ripley to complain about being harassed and doxxed when at least Katie previously collected thousands of tweets with the intent of punishing the posters, just as she intended to deplatform Ethan Van Sciver and likely intends to deplatform every single person mentioned in this hit piece that she has arbitrarily labeled as alt-right. I don't like cancel culture, but Katie seemingly does, and all I can say is that when you promote and engage in a certain behavior, how can you feign outrage when someone else does it to you? A possible collaborator of Katie's is Michelle, who publicly asked to help on the Rewriting Ripley project, and I feel I really need to introduce this player in the game by pointing out how she asked for academics to please respond to the proposed assessment of alt-right Star Wars fandom rabbit holes. Well, once again, I am responding. Now, why does this matter and how does this all tie back to Disney? Well, because when Rewriting Ripley had less than 600 followers on Twitter, a number of those followers were Disney employees, namely Lucasfilm Star Wars creative executive Pablo Hidalgo. Hidalgo previously got into some hot water on Twitter after telling a fan who posted a tearful reaction to the appearance of Luke Skywalker in The Mandalorian that, quote, "Emotions are not for sharing." But this alone was not enough, as he decided to make a screenshot of this tweet into his Twitter header and then locked his account when he received backlash. It does seem a bit odd that this creative executive would be following an account with less than 600 followers that just started, but hey, maybe it's completely organic and random. However, it's a bit harder to believe when you understand that Michelle, the woman who asked to help Katie with the Rewriting Ripley project, is a social media manager for Lucasfilm, and also manages social media for Nerdist. Further, Rewriting Ripley notes on their website that one of their writers is a Webby Award winner. But neither Katie nor Lady V have won a Webby. Michelle has, indicating that Michelle is potentially working for the website in some capacity. So let's break down what that means. Michelle is, or at least was, a Lucasfilm employee, specifically a social media manager. She reached out publicly on social media to work with Katie and Lady V, both self-professed Reylos, on what would become the Rewriting Ripley site. And there seems to be some evidence that she is working on that website due to the mention of the Webby Award. Despite being a brand new podcast and project with about 600 followers on Twitter, within a few weeks of starting this up, major higher-ups at Lucasfilm began following Rewriting Ripley. What's the first big thing that Rewriting Ripley then does? Well, it's published what can only be described as a hit piece with a thin veneer of scientism aimed at people critical of the Star Wars sequels. Written by Reylos, an almost undeniably toxic aspect of the fanbase, if any fanbase can be described as such, and with seemingly both direct and indirect ties to Lucasfilm from before the project even got really rolling. I must ask you, dear viewer, do you think the Rewriting Ripley post, the supposedly scientific analysis that we have just discussed, was made with malice, or was this just an organic response to an organic response, which they conveniently claim in their so-called analysis was also not an organic response? It gives me no real pleasure to bring up all of these relationships, but I think it's necessary that we put all of the bunk data we spent all of this time going over into a wider and more logical context. This knowledge makes it all make a bit more sense. So now that we've looked at the data and at the authors, let's wrap this long video up with a short discussion about scientism and by coming to a few conclusions. Today we took a very long look at what I think we all have to admit is a pretty obvious attack to harass other people and potentially cause them financial harm, dressed up, albeit poorly, as a scientific analysis. All because those people didn't like a movie made by one of the biggest media empires on Earth, who filmed one of their latest major projects in an area of China currently engaged in ethnic persecution against Uyghur Muslims. This is not just emblematic of the continuing issue of cancel culture, as usual coming from people guilty of many of the same crimes they accuse others of, or at least just as much supposed toxicity, but also of an ongoing trend of scientism, which I find increasingly worrisome. A major goal of this channel is to make social science more accessible, to make looking at and knowing how to read scientific outputs something that anyone can do because you can, and because there should be no barriers in the way of science, which is why you should all use Sci-Hub, because much, albeit not all, of the data that I put on this channel can be read in full there. What Katie and Lady V are doing here is the opposite. They are obfuscating science. They think that if they dress up simple data collected without comparison to normative measures, and heavily influenced by personal bias, along with some cherry-picked studies that I don't even think they read, and pop their meaningless data into a visualizer, it'll look really compelling to people who read I fucking love science articles and Snopes headlines, thinking that basically gives them an honorary doctorate. Why does it matter that they pretend that this is science coming from actual research? Well, one of the most infamous experiments in social science is the Milgram obedience experiment, which tasks subjects to purportedly shock a person up to death for answering questions incorrectly, and perhaps is remembered most for just how shocking it was, pun intended. But what the researchers were actually looking at here was acquiescence to authority, and not just any authority, but specifically academic authority. Regular people were willing to potentially kill someone because a guy in a lab coat said, please continue the experiment. That is the power of the lab coat and the power of scientism. To the average person who is inherently a cognitive miser because we only have so much time in a day to spend reading a massive document or listening to a long YouTube video, many will just look at these graphs that have labeled people as alt-right and think, oh well, that looks scientific, so it must be. And that's not an insult to people who fall for it. It's a direct condemnation of this tactic being used by Rewriting Ripley. There are some people that are just low in need for cognition, in that they don't care to think too hard about things. They just want to grill. The authors of this piece are reliant upon the reality that most people will not spend any part of their day reading the data or methods here beyond just looking at the pretty graphs. And they are relying heavily on the bet that no one will bother to actually fact check it. I don't doubt this giant blog post will at some point be cited as a study that proved the alt-right rabbit hole in the Star Wars fandom in the future, and that's precisely the point, and that is the real, true, longitudinal danger of scientism. When people believe a graph without looking at what it means, where the data came from, how the measurements were operationalized, and focusing so much on the word study alone at the cost of everything else. This is similar to what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said on this exact subject, that we miss the forest for the trees. Don't think about the data, just think about the feels.
I think that there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right.
Don't think for yourself at all. Don't investigate. That's a growing trend that I think we should be wary of, as a recent New York Times article warned that critical thinking itself was a potential to fall down a rabbit hole, and you should rely only on approved of sources like the New York Times, because you wouldn't know how to go to Sci-Hub and read a scientific study for yourself, you ignorant pleb. I hope I've displayed in this very long meandering video the insidious tactic of scientism that's been used here, and how these data, which have been manually manipulated, still don't even prove what the authors think they prove, and who I just think maybe don't have the background in this kind of work to even understand themselves what they're doing. Instead, this appears to be a case of a scientism article written not by scientists, but scientism enthusiasts, all to meet a political goal. And that all makes this particularly egregious. At least to me. But hey, what do you guys think? Why did Rewriting Ripley produce this document? Do you think they're actually trying to make the fandom less toxic, or are they intentionally stoking fires of toxicity so long as it helps their supposed political side? Have you ever found yourself immediately thinking something must have merit to it because it's in a graph or it's in a chart? I mean, I know I have once or twice. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for sitting through this very long video. It took a lot of time to put together, and if you enjoyed it in any way, please consider supporting the channel on my Patreon or my Subscribestar, checking out Surfshark VPN, or buying something from my merch store. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope I have entertained you and not completely bored you to tears. And as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.